So what I found really fascinating since I'm in that kind of line of work, or kind of line of research, is these gender patterns of violence. So we see that men experience far more violence than women, and this is the kind of general violence. It's the violence, so men really experience a lot of violence by acquaintances and strangers, this kind of fights in the pub, or really gang violence in Latin America, crime-related violence. So men very clearly have a violence problem, much more than women. And women report far less violence than men. But when you look at the type of violence that the women report from, who they report it from, it really is in the family, and it really is by their partners, unfortunately. I mean, looking at different regions, of course, gives you different kind of context. And with homicide, we have the same thing. So homicide really is a problem for men. And, they're 5 to 7 times more likely to be murdered than women. When you look across the world, and some Latin American countries, it's a huge problem. But again, when you look at who are they murdered by, women are more likely to be murdered by their partner. So I would say, 30 to 50% of women who are murdered by their partner. So 30 really is the conservative figure. While as for men, they're more likely to be murdered, but really not by their partners. So really 5 to 10% of male homicide victims are murdered by their partner. And I think it's really important to have this gender perspective, both for general violence and homicide, because we live in a world with restricted resources. We want to reduce homicide. If we just have a gender-insensitive policy, women fall off, because the general kind of homicide prevention strategies don't work for them. So for women, we really need to focus if we want to reduce female homicides, we really need to focus on the intimate relationships. And a lot of police know this as well, that you first, when a woman is murdered, you look at the partner, at the home, etc. So I think that's just the kind of channel. It doesn't mean that the other thing doesn't exist or it's not important, but really in a limited resource setting, when we want to reduce homicide among men, maybe starting in the relationship isn't the most important. We really should look somewhere else first and reduce these extreme high numbers. And same for women, you just need targeted responses. So in that term, in the tip of the iceberg refers to, it's a few numbers that show us what violence against women is there, and it gives us a rate and it gives us a number that we can observe, but it really is only, a very few cases, which is the most extreme form of violence, or also the most extreme health outcome of violence. So we have a lot of other health outcomes, for example, of violence, depression, and low birth weight, anxiety symptoms, higher suicidal rates, etc. But really homicide, where a person is dead afterwards, that's the most extreme tip of the iceberg. Femicide for me really refers to that political movement in Latin America, where they really drew attention to all these women who were murdered because they were women, because of their gender, which is really important, I think. I'm a quantitative researcher, so for me, femicide is, what does it mean then exactly? How can we categorize it? How can we collect data on it? And there it becomes quite difficult, because how do we really define it? Because it relates a lot to the motives behind it. But how can you categorize, because she's a woman, because of the gender? So it's not that I don't like the term, which is, I think, also very political, but it's more that I find it very hard to operationalize. And then maybe even going a bit further. So the word femicide comes from the Latin, it's murder against women. So, but what about all the men who are murdered because of femicide? So, for example, the new partners who are often murdered, or, some bystander, or someone who helps the woman, they're porny, or, there could be quite a range of people who are often murdered instead of the woman or with the woman. They would, in that definition, be femicides as well, although they are not. So it's more or the children. So it's more the operationalizing of it that I find difficult, and I think there's no agreed definition yet, really, on the topic and how we should measure it. So I should stick with female homicide, because I think it's clear, and it's probably also how we can convince policymakers, because we can have very clear data. As I'm interested in intimate partner homicide, so I'm interested in who murdered whom. And I find it really important that this question, who murdered whom and what is the relationship, is actually something where the data is very, very poor. While this, for me, is the main important information to create prevention strategies. But when you look at it, it's no surprise also that the data isn't that good, because the police finds so who reports into homicides? It's the police who finds the body, and they might report a suspect. But the suspect is a suspect. It's not someone who's proven to be guilty. That's kind of number one. The other person who gets the dead body is in the mortuary, or whoever does the examination. They also only have the body. And the court has the court data. But these are the kind of three pieces of information, but they need to find out who the perpetrator is, and then they need to report it. And then they need to have a system where they can report it in, and even if all these things are in place, the system who has the data needs to share it. And actually that's just not done. And in addition to that, in terms of comparability across countries, you have a lot of different definitions of homicide, and you have updated data systems like in the UK, where once the court information is in, they update their statistics retrospectively, what they don't do in other places. A very good example is Finland, where they can only close a case in the police file if they reported every single information. So they cannot close the police file if they haven't put down the victim-offender relationship, for example. So that's a very good way of doing it, I think, in order to have good information. There often was domestic violence before in the cases of female homicide victims. And actually also when there is a male intimate partner homicide victim, you also find that there was prior intimate partner violence by the man against the woman. I think the kind of trend that I also refer to in my blog, that women tend to murder their partner while they're in the relationship, versus men murder their partner during the separation or afterwards, relates quite a lot to that. So women tend to murder their partner in the relationship probably because they self-defended, they defended their kids or something else. Obviously there might also be other reasons, and we know that some women also have the same jealousy issues as men, but the percentage is much, much narrower. And men tend to murder their female partners more during separation and afterwards, and even years afterwards. And often it's related to jealousy. Oh, she's separated, if she's not mine, she's no one. It's a sense of entitlement that she belongs to him, and possessiveness, or just retaliation that she dared to do this, or it's about the children and the custody for the children. And that's, I think, the tragic thing as well about it, is that they often don't only murder the woman, they also murder the kids. And the effect on the children is, I think, often forgotten, because these children don't only lose the partner who's dead now, with either the mom or the father, they lose the other partner to the prison or the criminal justice system. So the other partner is immediately taken away if they don't commit suicide. And then these children, they either live with the family of the mother or the family of the father, and they all have, they might be, a lot of them are surely well-meaning, but they all have, either their own guilt of having the situation happen, or they're really angry with either the murdered victim or the perpetrator, which is still, one of the parents of the children. They often have to move, or they have to deal with the fact that they have one surviving parent who's now in prison. So when we look at the survey data, we find that younger women up to 24 or 29 experience more intimate partner violence. But when you look at homicide research, and this is data that's not published, but that's when I looked more in depth into the big review that I've once done, is that they tend to be older. And we don't really know the reasons, but I would hypothesize that it's linked to these are maybe long-going abusive relationships, but in the end with violence, that people didn't leave, etc. As you know, intimate partner violence is now part of SDG 5.2. It's one of the new targets for the, now Sustainable Development Goals, and I think the recognition that this is a problem, this is not okay, that's a very strong advancement in the field, because this will lead to better data on the issue, which in then turn also brings it to the attention of governments in each country, which do have to report their figures, and they have to defend them, and they also have to show what they're doing in order to reduce violence. So I think that's an amazing step forward, and a really important one.